the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It is September the 11th, 2024, and unusually, the headlines today are less about the anniversary of September 11th and more about the day after the debate. According to the New York Times, Harris and Trump bet on their own sharply contrasting views of America. Most people seem to think that Harris won the debate, although it'll be interesting to see whether it changes the voting. Time had an interesting comment. They said that at the beginning of the debate, the first policy to come up was one that rarely receives airtime in presidential elections, but affects Americans every day: housing affordability. Harris said, "Here's the thing, we know we have a shortage of homes and housing, and the cost of housing is too expensive for far too many people." She might be suggesting that there is what my guest today believes is a housing crisis in America. Jerusalem Demsas is an award-winning journalist for The Atlantic and the author of a new book. It's already a bestseller on Amazon, on the housing crisis and land development democracy. And Jerusalem is joining us from Washington, D.C. Jerusalem, were you impressed with those opening remarks from Harris? Did it require a little bit of political daring? Did she spend some political capital there?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The first question was certainly not about housing, but basically the first words out of her mouth is reminding people about the housing shortage and housing affordability and how those two things work together. I think that in general, it is remarkable to me how much national Democrats have become willing to take on what is considered the third rail of state and local politics, and talk about the housing shortage and talk about housing affordability. That's not something we've seen before, and it is really remarkable to witness that as someone who's been following this issue for years, and has seen Democrats, Republicans shy away from something that is very polarizing within their own parties.
Donald Trump spoke of America being in one kind of crisis or another. I don't know if you mentioned housing. As I said, your new book is on the housing crisis. That's strong language, Jerusalem. What exactly in your mind is the current American housing crisis?
Yeah, I mean, people obviously have a lot of problems with when they think about what's going on in their own housing. But what I'm mostly focused on and thinking about is this fundamental problem about, why is it that people can't get housing near good jobs? Why is it so difficult to find that housing? And what are the downstream economic impacts of that, right? Because when people can't move to good jobs, you get a great job in San Francisco, New York, you get something in the suburbs of, Nashville, Tennessee, wherever you are. If you can't, people tend to expect that there will be a house waiting for them. There'll be some place for them to rent. Once they get that good job, they just need to be able to figure out where they're going to live next. But economists have found something really, really devastating, which is that this wage premium that people would usually get when they move towards these really productive cities was being eaten up by the increase in housing costs. It used to be that even if you were someone who's working in a middle wage or a low wage job, if you moved from a rural town to a productive high wage city, the increased housing costs, the increased rent, the increased mortgage was still worth it because you were still making enough money. But increasingly, what we're finding is for larger and larger segments of the population, as they're reaching for these jobs, as they're reaching for economic opportunity, they're finding that there's not really even a point in getting there. What's the point in taking that job if you're poorer than you were before you left? And that is really creating a bunch of problems. I mean, it creates problems because people obviously want to make more money to live the lives they want to have with dignity and worth and buy the things that they need to have a good life. But it's also a problem because it creates massive downstream impacts. When housing is expensive, every other service becomes more expensive. Daycare becomes more expensive. That means people may reevaluate their decisions about having children at all. It means that they may change their own life goals and courses because it makes more sense for them to stay home than it does for them to continue working. There are so many knock-on effects from this fundamental problem of there's not enough housing near good jobs, and it's something that we could easily solve.
It seems to me, as someone who doesn't follow this, and certainly in comparison to you, that people have always been complaining about crime, always complaining about the quality of education. And housing is one of those things that everyone always complains about: the price of rents, the price of real estate. Give me some numbers, Jerusalem, on how this has changed over the last 25 or 50 years in terms of how much money people actually spend on their housing compared to everything else, food and everything else.
Yeah, I actually think the most telling statistic here is what we've done to quantify the number of houses we're missing. So multiple different estimates have come out and put that at around 4 million homes in the US. To put that into historical context, the last time we saw a shortage like that was in the post-World War II era when vets were returning home and there was a massive demand for housing and we hadn't built since before the Great Depression at any number. That's the kind of shortage we're facing right now. And it's not because of, the Great Depression. It's not because of, the fact that there are now a bunch of people returning home from a war. We are facing this problem because we have created a system at the local and state level that makes it extremely difficult to respond to market demand. People are always going to want better housing, bigger housing, other things. They're going to want rents to remain stable. But this specific problem where people who are making good job, someone who has a middle class salary, still can't afford to live near their work, who can't afford to buy into a home ownership, that is novel. That is not something the American experience has been used to, and it's something that's really driving the political conversation at the national level.
Yeah, I asked for numbers, Jerusalem. You talk about this 4 million, the missing 4 million homes. Mm-hmm. But how does it reflect that? My question was about how much people are spending. I've seen some numbers from time to time on that. Are people spending more money on rent and buying their homes than they have historically? Is that what's shifted? Because these missing 4 million homes, we can get onto that later. I don't really understand how that is manifested, maybe in homelessness or people not moving. But getting back to the costs of housing, has that changed over the last decade or two?
Yes, so significantly. The reason why I bring up the shortage of homes and that number is because it's driving the affordability problems. If you think about this as an economics issue, when you see that shortage go up, or when you see a shortage happen, you expect prices to rise. So what we've seen, right, is that the price of homes skyrocketed, particularly in the pandemic era. We saw the average price of a home going from in the 300,000s, and now you see in some markets in the U.S., 700,000, even $1 million is the average sale price for a new home on the market. That is something that is severely out of whack. The average house new sales price, we can look this up right now on Fred, but it's in the 400,000s now. That's an increase of 100,000 and more over the course of just a couple of years during the pandemic. But that's the sort of thing that's driving the affordability crisis, and that we see this with rents too. You look at statistics like when people are talking about the share of people's income that is being spent on rents. 30% of your income being spent on rent or more is when we consider you rent burdened. This is now the highest that we've seen since we've been tracking that number for the past 50 years. I mean, that is a serious, serious problem.
30% today, and then what would have been the number 10, 15, 20 years ago? 20%, 15%?
No, so the idea is, how many people are spending more than 30% of their income on rent is when we consider you rent burdened. We are now at the highest we've ever been.
How much of this, Jerusalem, is a generational? I mean, it's a crisis, or certainly you believe it's a crisis, but how much of it is bound up in a generational problem, a crisis of generations, where it's the baby boomers? A lot of work has been done on this. The New York Times ran an interesting piece recently. about how much, I guess it's dead money, lies in the hands of the boomers who own their own real estate, of course, and who can't live forever. So who presumably will leave the real estate or the sale, the dollars that come out of those real estate to their kids and their grandchildren. In other words, excusing the rather long-winded nature of this question, won't this work itself out generationally as the boomers die off and they give their homes and the proceeds from their homes to their kids and grandkids?
Well, I think it depends what you think the problem is, right? Because the question is also about whether people are being inhibited from economic opportunities and economic growth is being inhibited. We have multiple economic statistics, economics papers showing that GDP, wage growth, these things are being massively inhibited in this medium term before that happens. But I think it's also important to point out all of the costs that are accumulating also to those baby boomers. One organization, AARP, which advocates for the elderly, is a very big lobbying group in the United States. I mean, they have become very interested in how to solve the housing shortage because of the pain point they're realizing, which is that seniors who have bought housing are finding themselves locked into place, right? And so what's happening is they may have a house, but it's as they've gotten older, it's become inaccessible to them. They can't take the stairs anymore. For some of them, that may even mean they can't access the single bathroom that exists in their house. But when they want to go and downsize, when they want to go and find an ADA accessible, newer development, that will necessitate them leaving their community in order to access that housing. So even the people who have this access to this store of wealth, who have this access to this primary residence that they own, they themselves are inhibited by the fact that there's a shortage of the type of housing that's necessary in the communities they want to live in. So often people will say, oh, there's a bunch of other housing elsewhere, like it's not a big deal, there will be turnover and churn eventually. But what is the cost of waiting for that to happen? And are you inhibiting people's lives to a degree that will reduce overall well-being?
I wonder also in the context of your argument about this crisis, whether it reflects a shift in culture. In the 19th century, of course, Americans risked their lives, particularly moving westward, risked the elements. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't have jobs in California or in the West, but they did it because they were adventurous and they were risk-taking. If one today wants to go and live in where I am in San Francisco or New York, doesn't it require a degree of risk? You might be willing to, if not share a room, certainly share a house. Does your analysis reflect a more conservative culture, particularly amongst young people in America, that they expect to have homes if they get that job in New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles? And actually, it requires a bit of adventure, a bit of risk, and that's always been the case in American history.
So I think this is a really interesting frame of a question because it asks to think about the long arc of mobility in this country. And the first thing that I would say is that when people were moving to California, they were moving to jobs. They were moving towards economic opportunity. They were being pulled there by the wealth opportunities that the gold rush had created, and that's how the West gets settled, right? Is that there is this pull. So we have seen in the literature on economic mobility that we've seen severe declines in American interstate mobility, so the people moving around from state to state. And this is directly attributed to the fact that housing has become impossible to build. New housing has become nearly impossible to build for people who are entering into these markets. And that is something that, Americans were used to expecting. Like, you get to a new place, there's no local regulation stopping you from putting up shelter in that area. Yes, there's not a, nice new apartment building maybe waiting for you, but you can access shelter there. We did not have mass homelessness of this sort that we see in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, these tent cities. That is not a feature of the American urban landscape over the course of the 20th century, except during the Great Depression. That's the only time you see that. And now we see it again, Los Angeles, San Francisco, even smaller towns and cities across the country. And so this question you're asking about mobility, isn't there some sort of risk-taking that we should expect Americans to put up with? We are actually handicapping their ability to take these risks because we're making the risk not worth it. It used to be the case. You move to New York City on a dream and you're willing to really, rough it, and you're willing to live with a bunch of roommates and crowd into a bunch of underutilized space and not have a window or whatever it was, that was fine for you to do when you were young and you were excited to do that. We have actually made that impossible because those places are now taken up by other people. I think that New York is actually a really illustrative example of this. My sister moved to New York City and I went to go to college, and afterwards, she had a good job. She and her partner had great jobs, and they were living in like what we would consider substandard quality housing. So how do you get to the point where substandard quality housing isn't reserved for the risk takers? It's actually being used by people who are making it well in life, because you've eliminated all of the types of housing opportunities that used to exist for those kinds of risk takers. So we're really undercutting American dynamism, the ability for people to take risks and move to new places and try new things and fail. People have always expected a level of, there's a place for me to go, even if it's kind of shitty. But now it's like there's nowhere for you to go.
We're going to get to your fixes later in this conversation, Jerusalem. But what about the uniqueness of America? It sounds to me like what you're describing is happening in New York is also true of London, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and many other large cities in the world. In your view, is this a global housing crisis? I mean, you write specifically about America. Or is there something, as so always with America, uniquely American about this crisis?
So the thing that's unique about America is, and we do see in other countries similar pathologies coming up around the expensiveness of rents and housing in their superstar cities and in the suburbs. I mean, London is a great example of this, London and suburbs. What's unique about America is, first of all, America is massive. I mean, compared to other countries, the number of cities we have that are economically productive and the number of suburbs we have that are economically productive is just, it's unparalleled essentially in the Western world. Other countries are much, much smaller. Yet what we have in the US too is a level of decentralization that makes solving this crisis really problematic. New Zealand in many ways is an interesting comparison to the United States. So New Zealand has very similar issues that we did in terms of making it more difficult to build housing. They had a bunch of opposition from not in my backyard, NIMBY kind of opposition to new development. But because they have a more centralized political system, in the US, we have 90,000 units of local government, right? That's a massive amount of decentralization. You don't see that sort of thing in other Western developed nations. In New Zealand, for instance, though, they're able to have a national conversation, a regional conversation, and shift housing policy over large markets. And it massively changes the number of housing units that get built. It really affects the affordability. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you can look up the New Zealand research on how they have been able to bring down rent appreciation and home price appreciation as a result of these reforms. But in the United States, you can't do that. You have to go from county council to city council to zoning chair to, advisory neighborhood commission. All of these tiny little hyper-local units of government that make it really, really difficult to resolve this problem, particularly because it should be easy to resolve in such a big country. There's actually a lot of room.
It's interesting. I was in New Zealand last year. I spent a week driving around the South Island. I was struck not just by the beauty of the place, by the fact that you didn't have what we think of as American sprawl. That the cities, there weren't many cities, even the towns were pretty well enclosed. We've done some shows, certainly on American suburbia and what now known as exurbia. Interesting new book on that. How does your argument fit in with that? Because the common assumption is that American urbanism sprawls so much, so badly, that you can always find a place to live. You might have to go out to the suburbs, or even worse, the exurbs, but you'll find something or somewhere. How does the sprawl of American cities add, I'm guessing, in your view, to this crisis?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, as I mentioned, in the aftermath of World War II, right, all those vets return home, they're getting married, they're having kids, they're having the kids that will become the baby boomers, the largest generation in American history. And what ends up happening is the federal government invests in the national highway system, and they build out the American highway network in the 50s. And as a result, private developers, now that people can access these sorts of suburban and exurban areas, they begin building the suburbs. They build suburbs. I mean, it is a moment of extreme growth in the United States, and the physical landscape shifts significantly. And as a result, you're able to have all of this room, right? People go further and further out as more and more people, and there's no real pressure, right? Like all you have to do is, okay, I'll just go one street over, we'll build a new house and we'll live there. There's no real problem with finding an affordable house if you're willing to commute, 30 to 45 minutes or something like that. But there's a limit to what most people will do to commute to their jobs, right? Commuting zone is a concept. I mean, economists use this, urban scientists use this to determine how long people are willing to go before the majority of us will sort of say, like, I'm not gonna do this, right? And for most people, 30, 45 minutes, you'll do it. But almost everyone says no after 2 hours. Very few people are gonna do longer than a 2-hour commute. So what ends up happening is after the baby boomers and the Gen Xers really build out and take up all of that suburban housing, there becomes increased pressure to build what we call infill housing, which means housing that's already in the inner core. It's reusing existing structures, already developed land more intensely. So something that was a parking lot, we're converting that into a duplex, or taking a single family home and turning that into a 4-unit apartment building. That's kind of intensification pressure happens on cities. But the problem is, there's a lot of people who don't want to see construction in their community. There are people who like the idea.
NIMBYs, of course, not in my backyard, as opposed to YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard. We're going to come to that in terms of your fix. Jerusalem, you mentioned the post-war period. Of course, Levittown comes to mind very much as the model for post-war American housing, and yet it was rooted in a kind of racism. I think African Americans weren't offered leases, opportunities, the opportunity to buy or rent homes there. How much, in your view, race always seems so central in American politics. How much is this the racial division? Some people might call it a racial crisis. Certainly, unease between whites and blacks, which has changed since the war, given the civil rights movement. How much does this play into the housing crisis?
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about the origins of zoning, so when we talk about why it's so hard to build new housing, what we're usually referring to are local regulations that have made it, that have determined that only certain types of housing can be built. So only a single family home can be built on this lot of land, even if you own it. You can't put like a mother-in-law suite in the backyard. You can't convert your garage to an apartment. You can't build a duplex. These are zoning regulations. So zoning regulations are conceived in the 1910s after the Supreme Court says that it is no longer permissible to explicitly put parts of the city for Black people or for Chinese people or for white people. You are not allowed to have that explicit policy of racial segregation in your housing policy, in your urban policy. And so as a result, cities, they're very innovative. And so they come up with a system that looks facially neutral. Instead of saying only white people can live here, they instead say only large single family homes are allowed to be built here. Instead of saying only Black people should live here, they say only apartment buildings will be built in this part of town. And then you have this sort of class segregation that results out of this, right? Because at this point, obviously, there are lots of people of color in the United States who can afford to buy single family homes, lots of people who are able to do that of all races. But class segregation still persists, right? Because if you say that the only people who can live here, who can go to these schools, who can live in this town, are people who can afford to buy or rent a home that sits on 10,000 square feet of land, you are essentially saying you have to be richer than the average American in order to be able to live here. And I think we forget the baby boomers, right? Their homes, the average starter home, that's a 1,500 square foot home that we're talking about. Right now, the idea that you could build a 1,500 square foot single family house is laughable in the vast majority of this country.
One more question before we get to some of the fixes, Jerusalem. You wrote an interesting piece for The Atlantic recently about what the Supreme Court doesn't get about homelessness. I'm talking to you from San Francisco, which at least Republicans see as the model of, if that's the right word, for homelessness. You mentioned it with Los Angeles. Is there a direct connection between the housing crisis and homelessness? We've done many shows on the crisis of homelessness. It's certainly a crisis, particularly on the West Coast. And there seems to be an argument amongst experts and social activists about whether or not many homeless Americans actually want to be homeless. What's your take on the crisis of homelessness and the housing crisis? Are they separate crises, or are they basically the same crisis?
So when you look at the research, and this is Greg Colburn, he's at University of Washington, and his partner, whose name I'm unfortunately forgetting, but they wrote a book called Homelessness is a Housing Crisis. And what they do is they look across the United States and they look at traditional explanations of homelessness. They look at questions like drug use or mental illness or poverty, and they say, if it's the case that homelessness arises because of high rates of drug use, you should expect that in states with higher rates of drug use, you should have higher rates of homelessness. If homelessness arises because of higher rates of mental illness, in states with higher rates of mental illness, or in cities or in counties with higher rates of mental illness, then you should see higher rates of homelessness. You do not find even this basic correlation, right? You don't see in West Virginia, where you see high rates of poverty, that there's high rates of homelessness. There's actually an extremely high home ownership rate in West Virginia. What they find instead is that you see a very, very obvious relationship between places that have very expensive rates of very high rents for low income and affordable housing, and
like San Francisco or Los Angeles.
Yeah, so San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., New York City, all of these sorts of very expensive cities that have very small amounts of affordable housing, very small amounts of housing in general, and very low vacancy rates. So very low amounts of churn happening in the housing market, particularly on the lower end of that housing market. That is what has the significant relationship with homelessness. And I think it's useful to explain how linked housing markets are, because often people will look at new home developments and they're like, that's not housing a homeless person. That's not housing a low income person. You know, that's housing a rich yuppie with a job at Google or something like that. That's what's going on there. But when you understand how housing markets are linked, it becomes clear how building more housing affects everyone all the way down the chain. So there's really great research that's been done in the United States, but also in countries like Finland and other places around the world, where researchers will track the housing chain. They'll say, okay, this new building has been built and all these people moved in. Let's track and see where those people moved from. And they find those addresses of those places that people moved from and say, who moved into those units? And they go all the way down the chain, and they're able to find that when people are moving into new units, they're freeing up older ones that are then filled by people who are lower down the income chain. So you see this chain of housing moves, and when you don't build enough housing, this expensive housing, this new housing for rich people, they end up taking up housing that should usually be reserved for people who are middle class, and then of course all the way down the income ladder. And that's how you see high rates of homelessness. In the United States, it's not new to have mental illness. It's not new to have drug addiction. We've had drugs, mental illness, poverty for the entirety of our nation's history. What is new is that when you're afflicted by a personal crisis, that means you are now homeless. Instead of dealing with that in some, small but manageable shelter, you are now dealing with that on the street.
You better be careful, Jerusalem. I'm married to a yuppie who works for Google.
Oh, yeah. I have no problem with
but in all seriousness, there is, shall we say, some, I don't know if it's class conflict here. Certainly, I'm sensing it in some of your arguments. Is this part of the bigger problem, or maybe the parallel problem of growing inequality in America between the Google elite and everyone else, and the shrinking of the American middle class?
I definitely think this is about class conflict, but I actually think that it has less to do with so-called Google elite or yuppies or things like that. And it's more about the conflict between people who own property and people who don't own property. And this is particularly important when we think about local government, where we see that the people whose voices are really taken seriously, the people who vote, but also the people who are able to control local and state politics, particularly when it comes to development, are overwhelmingly homeowners. Boston University political scientists did a research study where they looked at whose voice is powerful in local zoning board decisions, and they focus on Massachusetts. And they're able to see that the most predictive thing, ahead of being, wealthy, ahead of being male, ahead of being white, the most predictive thing for being a participant in these local decisions is being a homeowner. And so what we see is that this actually is this conflict between property owners and renters, but it can also obscure, by using this frame too liberally, it can also obscure how much homeowners themselves are losing out in this system. As I mentioned, of course, before, there's that conflict that seniors are having, but also right now, there are tons of homeowners who bought in when interest rates were really low, who feel stuck in their houses and they can't move to opportunities that they may otherwise would have taken because there's not some expensive and affordable home waiting for them when they get there. So,
well, but that comes back. You've already dealt with this, but I have a feeling that sometimes people can take risks. So let me briefly, before we get to your fix, come back to your point about the West Virginia, San Francisco comparison. Next week, we've got Arlie Hochschild, one of America's leading sociologists. She has a very important new book out, Stolen Pride, which is a book about, it's a sociological analysis of poverty in some ways in Kentucky. A lot of the people she talked to are living in trailer parks. Are you, and excuse this question, I wasn't entirely sure on your response. Are you suggesting that the equivalent of homelessness in San Francisco or New York or San Francisco or in Los Angeles is living in a trailer park in rural Kentucky, and that they are essentially part of the same crisis?
I think it's obviously there are multiple things that are going on that can affect people within housing, right? Like you could have a landlord that treats you badly. You can be, a lot of people who live in trailer parks, they are not able to own the land underneath their trailer, underneath their mobile home. And that means there's tons of exploitation that can happen to them. So I'm not trying to pretend at all that there's nothing else going on in the housing market except for this issue that I'm focused on right now. But what connects those two groups of people is this idea that in blue states, in Democrat-run states, there has been basically a policy decision made that if the housing cannot be good enough, it should not exist at all. And so the alternative is, in New York City, right? Well, what they used to be are these things called SROs, these single room occupancy. This is also in Los Angeles. These were single rooms that would have shared amenities, or shared bathroom space, shared kitchen space, but single rooms. And they're essentially boarding houses, and it was where people would go as like housing of last resort. The leadership in cities and Democrat-run cities was decided they were going to ban this type of housing because they thought it was substandard. But the thing that happens when you ban substandard housing but you don't fix poverty is that people still have to live somewhere that's cheap. And so in places like New York and Los Angeles, instead of living in these single room occupancy, buildings, they now live on the streets. And so, the alternative is there's always going to be people who are at the bottom of the income ladder, and we should do as much as possible to provide government assistance to those people and also to raise economic opportunity to make sure they're wealthier. But there will always be someone who is poor. And the question of whether we let them live on the street or let them live in a house that we think is slightly substandard is a policy question that I think is easily resolvable.
Jerusalem, Donald Trump is no great friend of environmentalists. He's rather proud of this, drill, baby, drill. I'm not sure if he said it last night. He was preoccupied with other things. But borrowing that language, is the argument in your book in terms of on the housing crisis, because you're not just observing the crisis, you're trying to fix it. Could your argument be summarized by build, baby, build? Is the problem there just isn't enough housing and we just got to figure out how to build more of it? Is that the core problem?
Yes, the core problem is there's an insufficient supply of housing and we need to build significantly. The Kamala Harris has put out a plan to build 3 million new houses in her first term if she's elected. That's on top of the housing that's already being built. Basically, what you want is that the number of units that are being added to an area should at least equal the number of jobs that are being added to an area. And if that ratio is out of whack, then you're going to have increased home prices. That's just a natural response to that problem. And so getting to a better vacancy rate in these cities, making sure there's enough housing, building as much as possible, that is a prerequisite for solving any other issue. Once that happens, that doesn't mean all other housing issues are done. There's still the problems of exploitation. There's still the problems of tenants not being able to get equal access to legal counsel and eviction courts. There's still the problem of, basic quality of housing, making sure that it's not just the worst shoddy construction, wanting to have like prettier houses, better architectural standards for homes. All of those exist. But the prerequisite to solving any of those is making sure there's enough supply to begin with.
As I said, you've written some really provocative pieces in The Atlantic. You suggest that rising home prices is the only force stronger than polarization in America. And you've also suggesting that housing and the problems with housing breaks people's brains. Is one of the reasons it breaks our brains because it crosses traditional political boundaries? I mean, environmentalists, I'm sure, respond to your work and your argument, the build, baby, build argument, very differently. I mean, for some, it's a dangerous argument. For others, it's the solution. Does housing cross political boundaries? And in a sense, there might be one of those issues that can bring Americans back together.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a one that breaks ideological bounds, right? Exactly as you pointed, I think environmentalist reaction to this argument is a great example. I have environmentalists who say, yes, of course, you need dense housing to be built and multifamily housing to be built to reduce carbon emissions. Dense multifamily housing, you're sharing walls. It means you're sharing heating costs. You're lowering the amount of energy necessary to heat or cool your building. You're also lowering sprawl and car-dependent trips. Even car trips you do take are shorter because you're in a more dense location. It means it's also easier to build transit. And then there are some environmentalists who hear my arguments and think, hey, the environmentalism I come from is against development. It is concerned with the localized harms that come from construction. And to me, this article that you have up about the cultural.
Yeah, you wrote a very interesting piece about how it's tearing American environmentalists in Minnesota apart, in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I mean, that is a core place where you see this problem playing out. And environmentalists are having to decide whether the core of their ideology is blocking development or if the core of their ideology is reducing carbon emissions and making it possible for the planet to stay cool. And so, that's two different versions of environmentalism, and it's one that's really clashing.
It's interesting that it happened in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. I'm curious, did Tim Walz get involved in this fight? Does he have a dog here? Speaking of dogs, of course, they came up last night as well.
Yeah, Tim Walz was governor during this battle, and he ends up signing a bill that makes it easier to build more housing in the state. There's also a bill that has passed the Minnesota legislature that has reformed environmental legislation in the state to make it more difficult for people to sue on environmental grounds to block new housing development. And that is, I think, the environmental movement really coming to the same conclusion that I have, that the best way to build a green world is to build green housing and to do that densely.
Yeah, I used to live in Berkeley, and I know members of my own family were keen environmentalists, and they were involved in the NIMBY-YIMBY struggle there. Of course, everything always begins in Berkeley, like Kamala Harris, of course, who began her life there. You noted in your comparison earlier between the US and New Zealand that New Zealand has a stronger centralized government, a more effective centralized government. But does the American tradition of state government, of state strength, can it benefit? You wrote an interesting piece for The Atlantic about Texas being a national leader in clean energy generation and perhaps in building new homes. You also had an interesting piece about the crisis in Arizona of its housing bill that got killed by the US Navy. Can the tradition of state power benefit your build, baby, build argument, or is it always problematic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that centralization of power is necessary in order to get big things done. In order to manage all the competing interests and issues that come into play when someone wants to build, whether it's high-speed rail or they want to build a new housing development or they want to decide on the standards that are necessary to maintain clean air and clean water, you can't have thousands of municipalities deciding on different regulations here. You need the central government to come together to use its expertise, its power, and its resources to decide what is the standard for clean air, for clean water, for good housing. And once that happens, there can't be a bunch of bickering downstream where you break up markets. And, I think it's really telling that in the same places in the world that it's very, very difficult to build housing, it's difficult to build other things. Just like the UK and the US are both world leaders in transit costs, you also see that same thing with new housing being built. The places that are very difficult, it's very easy and cheap to build new transit. You also see cheaper rents, like places like in Spain, places like in Italy, places like, Turkey has somehow become a world leader as well in building new transit. And these sorts of things are not reliant on resources. These are not, Turkey and Spain are not richer than the United States. They just have decided that it's in their national interest to build things in the national interest. And the US has not made that decision in a centralized way. And it will suffer if it continues to allow thousands of local governments to make, vetoes of important national goods.
You've made a name for yourself as a housing expert, but also someone who suggested that it's an a structural crisis in America. How much is this finally, Jerusalem, how much is this bound up in this overall institutional structural crisis? You have the housing crisis, you have the education crisis, you have the medical system crisis. Is there something tying all these together? Some people might suggest neoliberalism or post-neoliberalism or the market or the absence of strong government. Is there one thing that ties together all these crises so that we can begin to address them in the 21st century?
I really do believe that localism ties together a lot of the crises Americans are facing right now. When you think about issues like income inequality or wealth inequality, a lot of that is driven by people not being able to take advantage of as many jobs, and they're not able to do so because it's become difficult for them to access that housing. The same thing when we think about daycare, when you think about people not being able to maintain their jobs because they need to, it's too expensive to even pay for daycare. Like those things are determined by housing costs. When we think about wealth inequality, most of Americans' wealth is held up in real estate. These are all really downstream of housing decisions and of local decisions that are being made without the democratic input of regular people. And what I mean by this is that it may be different in other countries, but in the United States, Americans are no longer local political animals. Americans do not vote locally. They don't know who their local representatives are. And even if they did, it would be impossible to hold them accountable because it's such a complicated matrix of different offices and people and institutions, many of whom are not actually democratically accountable at all. And as a result, you see that people are now pushing their anger about the housing market onto national Democrats and Republicans. They're mad about their housing and they're saying, I need the federal government to come fix it. And there seems to be very little awareness of the fact that actually what they need to do is to go down to City Hall, and that's who's to blame for the local housing crisis that they're facing. But I also have a lot of sympathy for local governments. I mean, I really, really criticize the amount of local power that we've institutionalized when it comes to land use and development. But at the same time, it's not about the individuals in local government. Often they're the very, very kind and well-meaning people. These are structural problems. If you live in a suburb of a big city, you can do everything you can to try to build as much housing as possible, but you're a small player in a large market. You are a small piece of the pie, and you can't really do very much to make things better. And on top of that, you're not even tasked with doing that. If I'm in Arlington, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., and I want more housing to be built there, if in DC they don't build housing, that affects me just as much as if they hadn't built housing in Arlington. We're all part of the same housing market here, and it needs to be governed by the same person.
Jerusalem, let's end by really scaring people. Your message and your analysis is quite chilling. But how bad can this get? What's the ultimate warning if we don't do anything? In the early 21st century, of course, we had the subprime crisis of mortgages, which I think in some ways compounded all the problems you're talking about. what's going to happen? What will America be like, say, by 2030, if these issues aren't addressed?
I think the fundamental problem that I foresee is, I mean, not just, of course, like declining wages, declining GDP and productivity, but also in particular, when things become scarce, Americans turn against one another. I think this is something that we've seen not just in the US, but around the world. I mean, Ireland is a place that has really prided itself on being welcoming and open, particularly when it comes to refugee resettlement. But a housing crisis has reformed its political system to the point where you have people protesting against even small numbers of refugees coming to Ireland because they feel like there's not enough available to them. In the United States, as we've seen scarcity become the name of the game when it comes to housing and basic costs of living, people have begun to turn against not just immigrants, but other people within the country itself. In Idaho, during the pandemic, you saw graffiti on the walls saying, go home, Californians. That kind of sentiment that is tearing apart the country, that is turning people against outsiders, that is defining out groups and in groups in a more and more insular way. That's what happens when people feel the scarcity as such an important asset. If you feel like your kid isn't going to be able to get a house, who are you going to turn against in order to make sure that happens? So to me, I very much feel like the very foundations of, lower L liberalism depend on people feeling like there's enough to go around.
Well, Jerusalem Demsas, the author of On the Housing Crisis, a very interesting, insightful conversation. Your new book, On the Housing Crisis, Land Development Democracy, is just out. It's a special Atlantic edition imprint. You also work for Atlantic. Congratulations, Jerusalem, on the new book. And we'll have to get you back on the show after the election to see how the Americans vote and whether it's going to have any impact on the housing crisis. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.